The year is 1870, and you're a weary traveler making your way across the desolate Kansas prairie. The sun is setting, casting long shadows across the endless grassland, when you spot a small roadside inn ahead. Your horse is tired, your stomach is empty, and the prospect of a hot meal and a warm bed fills you with relief. You approach the modest wooden structure, dismount, and push open the creaky door. Inside, you're greeted by what appears to be a typical frontier family, a gruff German patriarch, his stern wife, and their 2 adult children. The daughter, Kate, is particularly striking, with flowing hair and piercing eyes that seem to look right through you. She smiles warmly and invites you to sit at their dinner table. You're back to a canvas curtain that divides the small cabin. As you settle in for what you believe will be a simple meal before continuing your journey, you have no idea that you've just entered the lair of America's most notorious serial killer family. You don't know that behind that innocent-looking curtain, one of them is already reaching for a hammer. You don't realize that the seemingly hospitable Kate Bender has already decided that you'll never leave this place alive. And you certainly don't suspect that beneath your feet lies a blood-soaked cellar where the screams of previous travelers have long since faded into silence. Welcome to the horrifying true story of the Bloody Benders, a family of German immigrants who turned their Kansas roadside inn into a slaughterhouse, systematically murdering unsuspecting travelers for profit and twisted pleasure. Between 1871 and 1873, this seemingly ordinary family lured dozens of innocent people to their deaths using a method so calculated and cruel that it would inspire horror stories for generations to come. Their story begins in the remote prairie of southeastern Kansas, where the Osage Trail carried a steady stream of settlers, merchants, and drifters through some of the loneliest country in America. It was here, in this isolated wilderness where screams could echo for miles without reaching another human ear, that the Benders established their house of horrors. The year 1870 marked the beginning of what would become one of the most chilling chapters in American frontier history. Kansas had only been a state for 9 years, and much of its vast territory remained wild and largely unsettled. The Osage Trail, which ran through Labette County in the southeastern part of the state, served as a vital artery for westward expansion, carrying hopeful pioneers toward new lives and opportunities in the territories beyond. It was along this lonely stretch of prairie road that a family of German immigrants would establish what appeared to be a simple roadside business, but would prove to be something far more sinister. John Bender Sr., the patriarch of this murderous clan, was a man whose very appearance seemed to warn of the darkness within. Standing well over 6 feet tall with broad, powerful shoulders, he possessed the kind of imposing physical presence that could intimidate even hardened frontiersmen. His long, unkempt beard and wild hair gave him the appearance of some biblical patriarch gone wrong, while his deep-set eyes held a coldness that made even casual observers uncomfortable. Neighbors would later describe his voice as a low, guttural growl, speaking primarily in German with occasional bursts of French, as if the English language itself was too civilized for the thoughts that occupied his twisted mind. Those who encountered him noted that he walked with a peculiar stoop, his massive frame hunched forward as though he carried some invisible burden, and his gaze was perpetually downcast, as if he couldn't bear to look his fellow human beings in the eye. His wife, known simply as Ma Bender, was every bit as unsettling as her husband, though in entirely different ways. Where John Sr. was imposing through sheer physical presence, Ma Bender projected an aura of barely controlled rage that seemed to crackle around her like electricity before a storm. Described by those who knew her as possessing a hair-triggered temper and a tongue that could flay a man alive, she was the kind of woman who could silence a room simply by entering it. Some accounts describe her as tall and well-built, others as spare and wiry, but all agree on the intensity of her demeanor and the unsettling speed of her speech, as if words couldn't escape her mouth fast enough to keep pace with the malevolent thoughts racing through her mind. Her dark hair, streaked with premature gray, was often pulled back severely from a face that neighbors described as possessing a kind of harsh handsomeness that was somehow more disturbing than outright ugliness would have been. The two younger members of the family presented their own unique forms of unsettling behavior. John Bender Jr., a man in his early 20s, displayed what the people of that era would have called feeble-mindedness, though modern observers might recognize signs of severe mental illness or developmental disability. He possessed a facial tic that caused one side of his face to twitch involuntarily, and he was prone to sudden outbursts of inappropriate laughter that would echo across the prairie at the most unexpected moments. Despite these disturbing traits, or perhaps because of them, John Jr. was considered the most sociable member of the Bender clan, often engaging travelers in conversation and displaying a childlike enthusiasm that many found more unnerving than reassuring. There was something profoundly wrong in the way his eyes would light up when discussing death or violence, as though these topics held the same innocent fascination for him that flowers or birds might hold for a normal person. But it was Kate Bender, the daughter, who would become the most infamous member of this murderous family, and perhaps the most terrifying of all precisely because she appeared, at first glance, to be the most normal. Accounts of her appearance vary wildly, with some describing her as a stunning blonde beauty and others as a plain-faced redhead. But most agree that she possessed a certain magnetic quality that drew people to her like moths to a flame. She was what the locals called corn-fed, a full-figured young woman with what one contemporary account described as tigerish grace that few men could resist. Unlike the rest of her family, Kate was highly social, frequently attending dances and community gatherings in the nearby town of Cherryvale, where she charmed neighbors and visitors alike with her apparent warmth and vivacity. What made Kate truly dangerous, however, was not her appearance, but her mind. She was a self-proclaimed spiritualist, a practitioner of the religious movement that had swept across America in the decades following the Civil War, promising that the living could communicate with the dead through seances and other mystical practices. Operating under the grandiose title of Professor Miss Katie Bender, she traveled throughout the region giving lectures on spiritualism and offering her services as a medium and healer to anyone willing to pay her fees. But Kate's beliefs extended far beyond conventional spiritualism into territories that would have shocked even the most liberal-minded observers of her era. She was a vocal proponent of free love, arguing that traditional marriage was an outdated institution that restricted human nature. Even more disturbing, she advocated for incestuous relationships, claiming that blood bonds created stronger spiritual connections between partners. Perhaps most chilling of all was Kate's firm belief that human beings possessed not just the right, but the moral obligation to commit murder under certain circumstances. She preached that killing could be a form of spiritual purification, both for the killer and the victim, and that those who died by violence were actually being elevated to a higher plane of existence. Some accounts suggest that she believed herself to be the reincarnation of Jesus Christ, destined to lead humanity into a new age of spiritual enlightenment through the systematic elimination of those she deemed unworthy of life. These beliefs, combined with her natural charisma and striking appearance, made Kate Bender perhaps the most dangerous kind of killer, one who could convince others that murder was not just acceptable, but actually noble and necessary. The Bender family had arrived in Labette County, Kansas in late 1870, purchasing a tract of land just northeast of the small town of Cherryvale. Their timing was perfect from a predatory standpoint. The area was experiencing steady growth as more settlers pushed westward, creating a constant stream of potential victims traveling along the Osage Trail. The family's property sat at an ideal location for their purposes, isolated enough that screams wouldn't carry to neighboring homesteads, yet close enough to the main trail that weary travelers would naturally seek them out for food and shelter. Within months of their arrival, they had constructed a small cabin that would serve as both their home and their business, a combination general store and inn that catered to the needs of passing travelers. The cabin itself was deceptively modest, measuring just 16 feet by 24 feet, but its small size would prove to be a crucial element in the family's murderous methodology. The interior was divided by a large canvas curtain, repurposed from a covered wagon, that separated the living quarters in the back from the public area in the front where customers were served. This curtain would become perhaps the most infamous piece of fabric in American criminal history, serving as the concealment from which the Benders would launch their attacks on unsuspecting victims. The family slept behind this curtain, while travelers were invited to rest and eat in the front room, usually seated at a rough wooden table positioned with their backs to the dividing canvas. From the outside, the Bender establishment appeared to be exactly what it claimed to be: a simple frontier business providing essential services to travelers in an isolated area. The cabin was surrounded by the typical accoutrements of prairie life: a small barn for livestock, a vegetable garden where the family grew their own food, and various outbuildings for storage and other necessities. Neighbors, while noting the family's odd behavior and unsettling demeanor, had no reason to suspect anything more sinister than social awkwardness and foreign customs. The Benders paid their taxes, participated in community events when it suited them, and maintained the outward appearance of law-abiding citizens trying to make an honest living on the frontier. But beneath this veneer of respectability lay a carefully planned operation of systematic murder and robbery. The Benders had chosen their location with the calculating precision of experienced predators, positioning themselves along a well-traveled route where disappearances could easily be attributed to the numerous dangers of frontier life. Indian attacks, wild animals, accidents, and simple exposure were all common causes of death for travelers in that era, providing perfect cover for a family of killers who understood how to exploit the isolation and lawlessness of the frontier to their own deadly advantage. The method they developed for dispatching their victims was as efficient as it was brutal. Travelers would arrive at the cabin seeking food and shelter, drawn by the sight of lamplight in the windows and the promise of human companionship in the vast loneliness of the prairie. Kate, with her natural charm and apparent warmth, would greet them at the door, inviting them inside for a hot meal and a place to rest. The victims would be seated at the wooden table with their backs to the canvas curtain, never suspecting that death lurked just inches behind them, waiting for the right moment to strike. The family had accumulated an arsenal of hammers of various sizes, from delicate tools used by shoemakers to massive sledgehammers capable of crushing a skull with a single blow. While the victim sat eating and conversing with the family members visible in the front room, either John Sr. or John Jr. would position themselves behind the curtain, hammer in hand, waiting for the signal to attack. When the moment was right, usually when the victim was relaxed and distracted, the concealed attacker would strike with devastating force, bringing the hammer down on the back of the victim's head with enough violence to ensure instant incapacitation, if not immediate death. But the Benders were nothing if not thorough in their murderous methodology. Even victims who survived the initial hammer blow would not live long, as other family members would immediately rush forward to complete the killing, usually by slashing the victim's throat from ear to ear with a sharp knife. This combination of blunt force trauma and blood loss ensured that no victim would survive to tell the tale of what had transpired in that seemingly innocent prairie cabin. The bodies would then be dragged into the cellar beneath the cabin, where they would remain until the family could dispose of them under cover of darkness. The cellar itself became a charnel house of unimaginable horror, its walls and floor stained with the blood of dozens of victims. The stench of death and decay permeated the small space, creating an atmosphere so foul that even the hardened killers who created it could barely stand to enter. But enter they did, regularly checking on their grisly collection and preparing bodies for burial in the family's garden and orchard, where the decomposing corpses would fertilize the soil that produced the vegetables the Benders served to their next victims. This macabre cycle continued for nearly 3 years, with the Bender family perfecting their technique and growing bolder with each successful murder. They developed a keen eye for selecting victims who would not be immediately missed, preferring solitary travelers, recent immigrants, and others who lacked strong community ties or family connections that might prompt searches if they disappeared. The vast majority of their victims were men, often carrying significant amounts of cash or valuable goods that provided the financial motive for their murders. though the family's twisted psychology suggests that money was not their only motivation. The Benders appeared to derive genuine pleasure from the act of killing itself, treating murder not merely as a means to an end, but as an end in itself. Kate's spiritual beliefs provided a framework for justifying their actions, while the other family members seemed to revel in the power and control that came with taking human life. They were not simply robbers who killed to avoid identification. They were serial killers who robbed to support their murderous lifestyle, a distinction that would become clear only as the full scope of their crimes was eventually revealed. As their confidence grew, so did their ambition and their willingness to take risks. They began targeting not just random travelers, but specific individuals who caught their attention for various reasons, whether because of the wealth they carried, the isolation of their circumstances, or simply because Kate or one of the other family members developed a particular desire to see them die. This escalation would ultimately prove to be their downfall, as they would eventually target a victim whose disappearance could not be ignored or explained away by the harsh realities of frontier life. But for now, in those blood-soaked years between 1871 and 1873, the Bloody Benders continued their reign of terror, transforming a simple roadside inn into one of the most prolific killing grounds in American history. The prairie winds carried away the screams of their victims, the remote location concealed their crimes, and the lawless nature of frontier society provided them with the perfect environment for their murderous enterprise. The Bender operation was methodical, almost mechanical in its precision. For nearly 3 years, from 1871 to 1874, this family of German immigrants turned their roadside inn into what authorities would later describe as a slaughterhouse disguised as hospitality. But what made their crimes so effective wasn't just their isolated location or their carefully constructed facade of normalcy. It was their understanding of human psychology, their ability to read travelers, and their systematic approach to murder that would make them one of America's most efficient serial killer families. The inn itself was strategically positioned along the Osage Trail, a well-traveled route that connected Fort Scott to Independence. Travelers moving through this stretch of southeastern Kansas had few options for shelter, making the Bender establishment an almost inevitable stop for anyone journeying through the area. The family had essentially created a choke point, a place where weary travelers would naturally gravitate toward the promise of a hot meal and a safe place to rest. Inside the cramped 16 by 24-foot cabin, the Benders had perfected what can only be described as a killing machine. The layout was deceptively simple but devastatingly effective. The front portion served as the dining area where guests would sit at a small table to eat their meals. Behind them hung what appeared to be a simple canvas wagon cover, repurposed as a room divider to separate the dining area from the family's living quarters. This seemingly innocent piece of fabric would become the key element in their murder method. The process was always the same. A traveler would arrive, usually in the late afternoon or early evening when the light was beginning to fade. Ma Bender would greet them with what witnesses described as forced hospitality, her sharp tongue temporarily sweetened by the prospect of profit. She would invite them inside, offering them a seat at the table with their back to the canvas divider. This positioning wasn't accidental. It was carefully calculated to place the victim in the most vulnerable possible position. While the guest ate their meal, usually a simple stew or soup prepared by Ma Bender, the family would engage them in conversation. They would ask about their journey, their destination, and most importantly, whether they were traveling alone. Kate, with her practiced charm and claims of psychic abilities, was particularly skilled at extracting information from unsuspecting travelers. She could make them feel comfortable, even special, as if they had stumbled upon something remarkable in this remote corner of Kansas. Meanwhile, either John Bender Sr. or his son John Jr. would slip behind the canvas divider. The family had positioned a sledgehammer there, along with several smaller hammers of various sizes. The weapons were always within easy reach, always ready for the moment when the signal would be given. That signal usually came when the victim was most relaxed, perhaps leaning back in their chair or reaching for a second helping of food. The attack was swift and brutal. A single blow from behind with the sledgehammer would crush the victim's skull, usually killing them instantly or rendering them unconscious. If the first blow didn't finish the job, Kate or Ma Bender would quickly move in with a knife, slashing the victim's throat to ensure they were dead. The efficiency was remarkable and horrifying. From the moment the hammer fell to the moment the victim's body was dragged into the cellar, the entire process took less than a minute. But the Benders' method went far beyond simple murder. They had turned killing into a profitable enterprise that sustained their livelihood while feeding their apparent psychological need for violence. After each murder, they would systematically search through the victim's belongings, taking anything of value. Money, jewelry, weapons, quality clothing, even horses and wagons. Everything was either kept for their own use or sold in nearby towns where no questions would be asked. The bodies themselves were handled with cold pragmatism. Initially, victims were dragged down into the root cellar beneath the cabin, where they would remain until the family could dispose of them under cover of darkness. The cellar floor was packed earth, perfect for absorbing the blood that would flow from the corpses. When investigators later examined this space, they found the walls and floor stained dark brown with what could only be human blood, accumulated over years of systematic butchery. Later, usually within a day or two of the murder, the family would carry the bodies outside to their garden area. They had designated specific plots where they would bury their victims, usually stripping them naked first to eliminate any identifying clothing. The bodies were buried in shallow graves, just deep enough to keep scavenging animals from disturbing them, but not so deep as to require excessive labor. The Benders treated these burials as routine chores, no different from planting crops or tending livestock. What made their operation particularly insidious was how they used Kate's claimed psychic abilities as both a lure and a cover story. Kate would advertise her services as a spiritualist and healer in local newspapers, drawing people to the inn who might not otherwise have stopped there. She held seances, claimed to communicate with the dead, and offered to heal various ailments through what she called spiritual intervention. These services provided perfect opportunities to identify wealthy or vulnerable targets, while also creating a reputation that helped explain any strange occurrences around the property. The family's division of labor was clearly established and efficiently executed. John Sr., with his imposing physical presence and violent temperament, served as the primary executioner. His size and strength made him ideally suited for delivering the fatal hammer blows that would instantly incapacitate victims. Ma Bender handled the practical aspects of the operation, cooking meals, managing the store, and helping to dispose of evidence. She was also responsible for much of the planning, deciding which travelers represented the best targets and when conditions were right for an attack. John Jr., despite his apparent mental limitations, played a crucial role as a lookout and assistant. His seemingly innocent demeanor and childlike behavior made him less threatening to potential victims, while his familiarity with the local area made him valuable for disposing of bodies and stolen goods. Kate, with her beauty and charisma, served as the primary lure, drawing victims into the inn and keeping them relaxed until the moment of attack. The psychological aspects of their crimes were as disturbing as the physical violence. The Benders seemed to take genuine pleasure in the act of killing, treating it not just as a means to an end, but as an end in itself. Witnesses who survived encounters with the family reported that Kate in particular seemed to enjoy discussing death and violence, often expressing bizarre philosophical views about the right to take human life. She claimed that murder could be a spiritual act, a way of freeing souls from the constraints of physical existence. This twisted ideology appeared to be part of a broader set of unconventional beliefs that Kate promoted. She advocated for what she called free love, rejecting traditional marriage and family structures in favor of more fluid arrangements. Some sources suggest that she and John Jr. were not actually siblings, but rather lovers posing as family members to avoid social censure. Her communist leanings and rejection of formal education for children further marked her as someone operating outside the bounds of conventional society. The family's success in avoiding detection for so long stemmed from several factors beyond their remote location. The Kansas frontier in the 1870s was a lawless place where people frequently disappeared without extensive investigation. The local sheriff's department was understaffed and lacked the resources to conduct thorough searches for missing persons. Many travelers were drifters or immigrants with few social connections, meaning their disappearances might not be reported for weeks or months, if at all. Additionally, the Benders were careful to maintain relationships with their neighbors and the broader community. They attended local events, participated in community activities, and generally presented themselves as a respectable, if somewhat eccentric family trying to make an honest living on the frontier. This facade of normalcy provided them with protection from suspicion while also giving them access to information about potential victims who might be traveling through the area. The sheer audacity of their operation was perhaps its greatest strength. The idea that an entire family would systematically murder travelers for profit was so far outside the realm of normal experience that most people simply couldn't conceive of it. Even when bodies began turning up in the area, the natural assumption was that the deaths were the result of Indian attacks, outlaw gangs, or simple frontier violence. The possibility that a family running a roadside inn could be responsible for such carnage was almost literally unthinkable. As 1872 turned into 1873, the Benders' killing spree reached its peak. They had refined their methods to the point of mechanical efficiency, and their confidence had grown to the point where they were taking increasingly bold risks. They began targeting more prominent victims, including Dr. William York, whose disappearance would ultimately lead to their downfall. But even as they grew more reckless, their fundamental approach remained the same: lure, kill, rob, and bury, over and over again in an endless cycle of violence and greed. The full extent of their crimes may never be known. While investigators eventually discovered at least 9 bodies on the Bender property, the actual number of victims was likely much higher. Many bodies may have been moved to other locations, destroyed, or simply remain undiscovered in the vast Kansas prairie. Conservative estimates place their victim count at somewhere between 15 and 20 people, but some investigators believe the number could be as high as 30 or even 40. What is certain is that for nearly 3 years, the Bender family operated one of the most successful and horrifying criminal enterprises in American history. They had turned hospitality into homicide, transforming their humble roadside inn into a charnel house that would claim dozens of innocent lives. Their story represents a dark chapter in the settlement of the American West, a reminder that even in the pursuit of the American dream, some people were willing to embrace the most unspeakable evil imaginable. The Bloody Benders had created a perfect storm of opportunity, method, and motive. They had identified a vulnerable population of travelers, developed an efficient system for killing them, and found ways to profit from their crimes while avoiding detection. Their success was built on careful planning, ruthless execution, and an understanding of human nature that they used to devastating effect. By early 1873, the Bender operation had reached its terrifying peak. What had begun 2 years earlier as a humble roadside inn had evolved into something far more sinister, a killing machine disguised behind the facade of frontier hospitality. The family had perfected their deadly routine to an almost mechanical precision, and their confidence had grown with each successful murder. The inn's reputation among travelers was mixed, creating the perfect cover for their activities. Some who stopped there and lived to tell about it described the Benders as odd but harmless, praising Ma Bender's cooking or commenting on Kate's beauty and unusual spiritual beliefs. These survivors unknowingly served as the family's best advertisement, their testimonials lending credibility to the inn's legitimate appearance. But for every traveler who departed safely, another vanished without a trace. The Benders had developed an almost supernatural ability to identify the perfect victims, those whose disappearances would cause the least suspicion. Lone travelers with no local connections, drifters heading west with dreams of gold or land, widowers relocating after personal tragedies, men carrying substantial sums of money who had foolishly advertised their wealth. Kate's role in this selection process cannot be overstated. Her spiritualist persona attracted a steady stream of vulnerable individuals seeking guidance, comfort, or supernatural intervention in their troubled lives. She would hold seances in the inn's main room, claiming to channel messages from deceased loved ones, while carefully probing her clients for information about their circumstances, their destinations, and most importantly, their resources. During these sessions, Kate displayed a remarkable talent for psychological manipulation that went far beyond simple fortune-telling. She possessed an intuitive understanding of human nature that allowed her to identify loneliness, desperation, and emotional vulnerability with frightening accuracy. Those she deemed suitable for the family's purposes would find themselves invited to stay for dinner, to rest for the night, to experience the healing powers she claimed to possess. The family's methodology had evolved considerably from their early, more impulsive kills. They now approached each murder with calculated precision, taking time to study their intended victims' habits and weaknesses. John Sr. would engage male travelers in conversation about their journeys, subtly extracting information about their routes and expected arrival times at their destinations. Ma Bender would fuss over lone travelers like a concerned mother, insisting they were too tired or the weather too dangerous to continue their journey that evening. Their timing was crucial. The Benders learned to strike during periods when they could be certain of privacy and adequate time for disposal. They monitored the trail carefully, ensuring no other travelers were approaching when they made their move. They had also established relationships with local suppliers and neighbors that provided them with alibis and explanations for any suspicious activities around their property. The physical setup of their operation had become increasingly sophisticated. The blood-stained cellar now contained specialized equipment for processing their victims' bodies. They had constructed a crude but effective pulley system for moving corpses, installed better drainage to handle the blood, and even created a primitive preservation area where they could store bodies temporarily if immediate burial wasn't possible. Most disturbing was the almost industrial efficiency they had developed in stripping their victims of anything valuable. The Benders had learned to quickly assess and catalog jewelry, cash, weapons, and other items of worth. They maintained detailed records of their acquisitions, treating murder as a business venture with careful attention to profit margins and inventory management. Their disposal methods had also evolved beyond simple burial in the orchard. They had expanded their burial grounds to include areas near the creek, spots along the trail where erosion might naturally disturb remains, and even locations on neighboring properties where they could secretly enter bodies under cover of darkness. They had become experts at reading the land, identifying soil conditions that would accelerate decomposition and locations that were unlikely to be disturbed by farming or construction. The family's psychological dynamic during this period reveals the true horror of their situation. They had moved beyond the point where murder was merely a means to an end. It had become a source of satisfaction and twisted family bonding. Ma Bender, in particular, seemed to derive genuine pleasure from the planning and execution phases of their crimes. Neighbors would later recall her unusually cheerful demeanor following periods when travelers had gone missing in the area. John Sr. had assumed the role of the family's enforcer and executioner, taking pride in his ability to dispatch victims quickly and quietly. His preferred method remained the hammer blow to the back of the head, a technique he had perfected to ensure immediate unconsciousness while minimizing blood spatter that might stain the inn's furnishings or alert future guests. Young John Jr., despite his mental limitations, had found his place in the family enterprise as the lookout and gravedigger. His childlike enthusiasm for the family's activities was perhaps the most chilling aspect of their operation. He would often be seen around the property humming or whistling while performing tasks related to their murders, treating the disposal of human remains as routine chores. But it was Kate who had truly embraced the philosophical implications of their actions. She had developed an elaborate belief system that not only justified their murders but elevated them to acts of spiritual significance. In her twisted worldview, they were not simply killing for money, they were facilitating the transition of souls from the material world to the spiritual realm. She spoke of their victims as willing participants in a cosmic process that transcended ordinary moral considerations. This philosophical framework served multiple purposes for the family. It provided psychological comfort that allowed them to continue their activities without the burden of guilt or remorse. It created a sense of higher purpose that elevated their crimes beyond mere banditry, and it offered a recruitment tool for potentially bringing others into their circle, though there's no evidence they ever successfully expanded their operation beyond the core family unit. The Benders' success during this period also stemmed from their careful attention to maintaining their legitimate business operations. The inn continued to serve regular meals to paying customers, providing a steady stream of witnesses who could testify to the family's normal, hospitable behavior. They paid their taxes, participated in local community events, and maintained cordial relationships with their nearest neighbors. Kate's spiritualist activities, in particular, had gained her a considerable following among the local population. Women would travel significant distances to consult with her about deceased husbands or children, seeking comfort and guidance that she seemed uniquely able to provide. Her reputation as a gifted medium had spread throughout the region, bringing a constant flow of potential victims directly to their door. The family had also developed contingency plans for various scenarios that might threaten their operation. They maintained emergency supplies and transportation options that would allow them to abandon their property quickly if necessary. They had established false identities and documentation that could facilitate their escape, and they had carefully studied the local law enforcement capabilities, understanding exactly how much time they would have between the discovery of their crimes and the arrival of organized pursuit. By the spring of 1873, the Benders had achieved something remarkable in the annals of American crime. They had created a sustainable, profitable murder operation that appeared capable of continuing indefinitely. They had killed dozens of people while maintaining their position as respected members of their community. They had accumulated substantial wealth while avoiding any serious suspicion from law enforcement. Their confidence had grown to the point where they were taking increasingly brazen risks. Kate had begun advertising her services more widely, attracting attention from beyond their immediate area. The family had started targeting wealthier victims who carried larger sums of money but whose disappearances were more likely to prompt serious investigations. They had even begun discussing expansion possibilities, potentially establishing similar operations in other locations along major travel routes. But this growing confidence would ultimately prove to be their downfall. The same boldness that had allowed them to operate successfully for nearly 3 years was about to attract the attention of someone they couldn't simply murder and bury in their orchard. Dr. William York's disappearance would trigger a chain of events that would expose their entire operation and force them to abandon everything they had built. The irony is that the Benders' success had made them complacent. They had grown so accustomed to their routine of luring, killing, and disposing of victims that they had lost sight of the accumulating risks. Each murder had made the next one easier, but it had also increased the statistical likelihood that eventually someone would notice the pattern of disappearances along their section of the trail. Their psychological state during this final period reveals a family that had completely divorced themselves from normal human morality. They spoke of their victims not as people, but as resources to be harvested. They planned murders with the same casual attention they might give to planning a crop harvest or preparing for winter. They had created their own moral universe where killing was not only acceptable but virtuous, a necessary service they provided to facilitate the cosmic order. This complete moral inversion would prove to be both their greatest strength and their ultimate weakness. It allowed them to continue their activities without the psychological barriers that would have stopped normal individuals. But it also blinded them to the growing danger their actions posed to their own survival. They had become so focused on the mechanics of murder that they had lost sight of the broader implications of their crimes. By the spring of 1873, the Bender operation had reached a level of sophistication that would have impressed even the most methodical criminal minds of their era. What had begun as opportunistic murders of lonely travelers had evolved into something far more calculated and systematic. A business model, if you will, built on death and deception. The family had perfected their technique to an almost mechanical precision. Every aspect of their deadly hospitality had been refined through trial and error, creating what investigators would later describe as a murder machine disguised as frontier kindness. The timing of their attacks, the disposal of bodies, the selection of victims, even the way they presented themselves to the outside world, everything had been honed to maximize profit while minimizing risk. Kate Bender had become particularly skilled at identifying the most promising targets. She could assess a traveler's wealth within minutes of their arrival, noting the quality of their boots, the weight of their saddlebags, the nervous way some men touched their coat pockets where money belts might be hidden. Her spiritualist performances weren't just elaborate theater. They were reconnaissance missions that allowed her to probe for information about a person's destination, their family situation, whether anyone would come looking if they failed to arrive. The family had also developed an intricate system for processing their victims' belongings. Anything too distinctive or recognizable was destroyed immediately, burned in the cabin's fireplace, or buried separately from the bodies. Generic items like clothing, tools, and basic household goods were cleaned thoroughly and sold at markets in distant towns, sometimes weeks after the murder. Valuable items like jewelry, quality weapons, or significant amounts of cash were kept locked away, only surfaced gradually to avoid suspicion. Ma Bender had taken charge of what might be called the administrative side of their enterprise. She maintained mental records of every victim, tracking not just their possessions, but also details about where they'd come from and where they'd been headed. This information proved invaluable when curious neighbors or occasional lawmen asked questions about missing persons. The family could provide just enough accurate detail to seem helpful while steering suspicion away from themselves. John Sr.'s role had evolved beyond the physical act of murder. He'd become the family's advanced scout, traveling to nearby towns under various pretenses to gather intelligence about potential victims. He'd loiter around stables and general stores, listening for talk of travelers carrying large sums of money or valuable cargo. Sometimes he'd even strike up conversations with promising targets, casually mentioning the excellent hospitality available at the Bender Inn, planting seeds that would draw victims to their doorstep days or weeks later. Even John Jr., despite his mental limitations, had found his place in the family's deadly routine. His childlike demeanor and apparent harmlessness made him perfect for approaching skittish horses or helping nervous travelers feel at ease. Victims who might have been suspicious of the other family members often let their guard down around John Jr., seeing him as too simple to pose any threat. It was a fatal miscalculation that the family exploited ruthlessly. The Benders had also expanded their operation beyond their own property. They'd cultivated relationships with certain unsavory individuals in the broader region, people who could provide information about wealthy travelers or who might be willing to direct potential victims toward the Bender Inn. These weren't formal partnerships, more like informal networks of mutual benefit where information and occasional favors were exchanged. One of their most diabolical innovations was the way they'd begun manipulating the very real dangers of frontier travel to cover their crimes. When bodies were eventually discovered, as they inevitably would be, the evidence suggested death by the hazards everyone expected on the frontier. Attacks by wild animals, accidents, conflicts with hostile Native American tribes, or encounters with roving bandits. The Benders had become expert at staging scenes that told believable stories that didn't point back to a family of German immigrants running a roadside inn. They'd even learned to vary their methods slightly to avoid creating too obvious a pattern. While the hammer blow to the back of the head followed by throat cutting remained their preferred technique, they occasionally employed other methods. Some victims were strangled, others were poisoned with substances Kate had learned to prepare through her study of folk medicine and spiritualist practices. The variation made it harder for anyone to connect the deaths to a single source. By early 1873, the Bender family was operating with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. They'd successfully murdered dozens of people over nearly 3 years without facing any serious scrutiny from law enforcement. Their inn was regarded as a legitimate business. Kate's spiritualist activities had earned her a reputation that extended well beyond Labette County, and they'd accumulated wealth that far exceeded what most frontier families could hope to achieve through honest work. This confidence, however, would prove to be their undoing. Success had made them bold, perhaps too bold. They'd begun targeting victims who were more likely to be missed, people whose disappearances would prompt serious investigations rather than resigned acceptance of frontier hazards. They'd also grown careless about some of the smaller details that had previously kept them safe. The most significant change in their operation was the sheer scale of their ambitions. What had once been opportunistic murders committed when particularly tempting targets presented themselves had become an almost industrial process. They were actively seeking out victims, sometimes traveling considerable distances to identify and lure potential targets back to their inn. The frequency of their murders had increased dramatically, as had the boldness of their victim selection. Kate, in particular, had begun to believe her own mythology. Her spiritualist persona had started as a calculated deception designed to manipulate victims and provide cover for the family's activities. But success had convinced her that she possessed genuine supernatural powers, that the spirits were actually guiding their murderous work. This delusion led her to take increasingly dangerous risks, confident that supernatural protection would shield the family from consequences. The family had also grown more violent in ways that served no practical purpose. Early victims had been killed efficiently, with minimal suffering beyond the initial attack. But by 1873, there was evidence that some victims had been tortured before death, not for information or practical gain, but seemingly for the family's psychological gratification. The line between murder for profit and murder for pleasure had become increasingly blurred. Their disposal methods had also grown more elaborate and disturbing. The simple graves in the orchard had given way to more complex burial arrangements, with some bodies dismembered to fit into smaller spaces, others arranged in positions that suggested ritualistic elements. Kate's growing obsession with spiritualism had infected the family's approach to their victims, turning murder into something approaching religious ceremony. Perhaps most ominously, there were signs that the Benders were no longer content to operate alone. Investigators would later uncover evidence suggesting they'd been in contact with other criminal elements, possibly sharing information about potential victims or even coordinating activities across a broader geographic area. The isolated family of murderers had begun to see themselves as part of something larger, a network of like-minded individuals who could support and enhance each other's criminal enterprises. All of these factors, the increased frequency of murders, the growing boldness of victim selection, the elaborate disposal methods, the possible connections to other criminals, created a situation that was inherently unstable. The Benders had built their success on remaining invisible, on being seen as just another frontier family, struggling to make an honest living. But their expanding operation required them to interact with more people, take greater risks, and leave more evidence of their activities. The web of deception they'd so carefully constructed over nearly 3 years was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Too many people had passed through their inn and lived to tell about it, creating witnesses who could potentially identify inconsistencies in the family's stories. Too many bodies were accumulating in too small an area, making discovery increasingly likely. And too many people were starting to notice patterns in the disappearances along the Osage Trail. By March of 1873, the Bender family was operating at the peak of their deadly efficiency, but they were also closer to exposure than they realized. The very success that had made them confident and wealthy had also made them visible to the kind of attention that would ultimately destroy them. The systematic approach that had kept them safe for so long was about to become the evidence that would damn them. The stage was set for the encounter that would begin their downfall, though none of them could have predicted that their next victim would be the one whose disappearance would finally bring the full weight of justice crashing down upon their carefully constructed house of horrors. By spring of 1873, the Bender family's operation had reached a level of sophistication that bordered on the terrifying. What had begun as opportunistic murders of isolated travelers had evolved into something far more calculated and systematic. The family had perfected not just their methods of killing, but their entire approach to selecting, manipulating, and disposing of victims in ways that would keep them operating undetected for years. The key to their success lay in understanding human psychology better than most people understood themselves. Kate Bender, in particular, had developed an almost supernatural ability to read people within minutes of meeting them. She could identify the lonely, the desperate, the greedy, and the vulnerable with startling accuracy. A traveling salesman boasting about his profits would find himself subjected to Kate's most charming spiritualist performance, while a grieving widower would receive gentle counseling about contacting his deceased wife. Each approach was carefully calibrated to the victim's specific emotional needs and weaknesses. The family had also refined their intelligence gathering to an art form. They maintained a network of contacts throughout southeastern Kansas who would report on travelers, their routes, their cargo, and most importantly, whether anyone would miss them if they disappeared. Local store owners, stable hands, and even other innkeepers would casually mention to the Benders when a particularly wealthy or isolated traveler was heading their way. This network operated under the guise of normal frontier hospitality and information sharing, but it effectively turned the entire region into a hunting ground for the family. Their physical setup had evolved as well. The notorious canvas curtain that divided their cabin served multiple purposes beyond concealment. It created an intimate, almost confessional atmosphere that made victims feel they were receiving special, private attention. The seating arrangement was precisely calculated. Guests were always positioned with their backs to the curtain, supposedly to give them the best view of Kate's spiritualist performances or to face the warmth of the fireplace. But this positioning also left them completely vulnerable to attack from behind. The family had experimented with different methods of incapacitation and had settled on their hammer technique not just for its effectiveness, but for its silence. A gunshot would alert neighbors or other travelers, but the dull thud of a hammer-striking skull could be easily masked by normal household sounds or explained away as construction work. They had tested various sizes and weights of hammers, eventually settling on a medium-weight sledgehammer that could deliver a devastating blow without requiring excessive strength from the wielder. Their timing had become incredibly precise. The attacks always occurred after the victim had eaten and was relaxed, often slightly drowsy from the meal, and Kate's mesmerizing spiritual performances. The family had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when someone was most vulnerable, when their guard was completely down and their reflexes dulled. They had also perfected the coordination between family members, with each person knowing exactly when to move and what role to play in the deadly choreography. The disposal methods had evolved through grim trial and error. Initially, they had simply buried bodies in shallow graves around their property. But this proved problematic when animals began disturbing the sites. They developed a system of deeper burial in their garden area, where the disturbed soil could be explained as normal farming activity. They learned to strip victims completely, as clothing decomposed at different rates and could create suspicious mounds or depressions in the earth. Personal effects were either destroyed in their fireplace or sold discreetly in distant towns where they wouldn't be recognized. Perhaps most chillingly, the family had developed methods for extracting maximum value from each victim. Beyond the immediate robbery of cash and valuables, they had learned to forge documents, assume identities temporarily to access bank accounts, and even impersonate victims in letters to family members to delay searches. Kate's spiritual persona provided the perfect cover for having unusual knowledge about people, as grieving families often shared intimate details during seances that could later be used for fraudulent purposes. The psychological dynamic within the family had also reached a disturbing equilibrium. John Sr. provided the physical intimidation and brute force when needed. Ma Bender handled the practical aspects of disposal and maintained the household's normal appearance. John Jr., despite his apparent mental limitations, had proven surprisingly adept at the mechanical aspects of their crimes, maintaining their tools and assisting with the physical demands of body disposal. Kate orchestrated the entire operation, using her charisma and intelligence to lure victims while her twisted spiritualist beliefs provided the family with a warped justification for their actions. By early 1873, they had developed contingency plans for various scenarios. They knew exactly how to respond if law enforcement came calling, having rehearsed their stories about travelers passing through and their ability to account for their time and activities. They had established multiple escape routes and had money and supplies cached at various locations in case they needed to flee quickly. They had even discussed how to eliminate each other if capture seemed imminent, viewing death as preferable to the disgrace and punishment that would follow exposure. The family's confidence had grown to the point where they were taking increasingly bold risks. They had begun targeting victims who were better connected, wealthier, and more likely to be missed. Kate had started advertising her spiritual services more widely, drawing attention that would have been unthinkable in their early days. They had accumulated enough wealth that they no longer needed to kill for basic survival, but the psychological compulsion had become too powerful to resist. The act of murder had become an addiction, with each successful kill reinforcing their sense of power and invincibility. Most disturbing of all was how completely they had normalized their crimes within their family structure. Discussions about potential victims were conducted with the same casual tone that other families might use to plan their crops or discuss the weather. This linguistic manipulation helped them maintain psychological distance from the horror of their actions, while strengthening their sense of shared purpose and family unity. The spring of 1873 found the Bender family at the height of their powers, operating with a level of efficiency and confidence that made them perhaps the most dangerous killers on the American frontier. They had created a perfect storm of psychological manipulation, strategic planning, and brutal execution that allowed them to operate in plain sight while accumulating a body count that would shock the nation. By spring of 1873, the Bender family operation had reached a dangerous peak of arrogance and overconfidence. Nearly 3 years of successful murders had created a sense of invulnerability that would ultimately prove to be their downfall. The isolation that had once protected them now worked against them, as the sheer number of disappearances along the Osage Trail had begun to draw serious attention from authorities and concerned families. The Benders had grown careless in their selection process. Where they once meticulously chose isolated victims with no immediate family connections, they now targeted travelers with prominent relatives and established networks. This shift represented a fundamental miscalculation that would expose their entire operation. The very success that had emboldened them also made them predictable, creating patterns that observant investigators could finally piece together. Their psychological control over potential victims had also evolved into something more sophisticated and dangerous. Kate Bender's spiritualist performances had become elaborate theatrical productions, drawing larger audiences from neighboring towns. She would hold seances that lasted for hours, during which she claimed to receive messages from the spirit world about the futures of those present. These gatherings served multiple purposes beyond entertainment. They allowed the family to identify wealthy travelers, assess their vulnerability, and determine whether they carried valuable items worth the risk of murder. The seances also provided Kate with detailed personal information about potential victims that she could later use to manipulate them during their stay at the inn. She would casually reference details about their lives that she had supposedly learned through spiritual communication, creating an atmosphere of mysticism and inevitability that made victims more compliant and less suspicious of their circumstances. John Bender Sr. had become increasingly brutal in his methods during this period. The sledgehammer blows that once killed victims quickly now often left them merely unconscious, allowing for more prolonged suffering before death. Witnesses who later examined the bodies reported evidence of torture that extended well beyond the family's original quick kill approach. Fingernails torn from their beds, burn marks from heated metal implements, and signs of prolonged strangulation suggested that the murders had evolved from efficient robbery killings into sadistic rituals. The family's disposal methods had also grown more elaborate and risky. Rather than simply burying bodies in their garden, they had begun dismembering some victims and scattering remains across a wider area. Parts of bodies were found miles from the inn, suggesting either that the Benders were traveling farther to dispose of evidence, or that they had developed a network of accomplices who assisted in body disposal. This expansion of their criminal enterprise created more opportunities for discovery and more potential witnesses to their activities. Ma Bender's role had evolved from passive participant to active orchestrator of the family's psychological manipulation tactics. She had developed an intricate system for drugging victims' food and drink with substances that made them drowsy and compliant. Opium, which was readily available at the time for medicinal purposes, was her preferred method, but she also experimented with various plant-based toxins that could incapacitate victims without immediately killing them. This allowed the family to move unconscious victims to their killing chamber without struggle or noise that might alert other travelers in the area. The blood-stained cellar had become a grotesque workshop where the family refined their murder techniques. They had installed specialized restraints, drainage systems to handle the increasing volume of blood, and even primitive preservation methods that allowed them to keep certain body parts as trophies. The space had evolved from a simple hiding place for bodies into a sophisticated torture chamber that revealed the depths of the family's depravity. John Bender Jr.'s mental state had deteriorated significantly during this period, but rather than becoming less dangerous, his instability made him more unpredictable and violent. His episodes of inappropriate laughter had intensified, and he had begun talking to the victims' corpses as if they were still alive. This psychological breakdown manifested in increasingly erratic behavior that made him a liability to the family's operations, though his physical strength and willingness to commit violence kept him useful for the actual murders. The financial success of their criminal enterprise had also created new problems for the Benders. They had accumulated more wealth than could be easily explained by their legitimate inn and store operations, forcing them to develop increasingly complex methods for laundering their stolen money. They had established relationships with merchants in distant towns who would purchase their stolen goods without asking too many questions. But these transactions created a paper trail that observant investigators could potentially follow. Their success had also attracted attention from other criminal elements operating in the region. Stories of the Benders' wealth and isolation had reached the ears of outlaw gangs who saw them as potential targets for robbery. This created a dangerous situation where the family found themselves not only at risk of discovery by law enforcement, but also vulnerable to attack from other criminals who might expose their operations in the process of robbing them. The community around the Bender Inn had begun to change as well. New settlers were moving into the area, bringing with them different expectations for law and order. The frontier mentality that had allowed the Benders to operate with minimal scrutiny was giving way to more organized community structures that would inevitably lead to closer examination of their activities. Local religious leaders had also begun to take notice of Kate Bender's spiritualist activities, viewing them as a threat to traditional Christian values in the community. Several ministers had spoken out against her seances and spiritual healing claims, creating social pressure that made some community members more suspicious of the entire family. This religious opposition represented a new form of scrutiny that the Benders had not previously faced. The transportation networks that had initially brought victims to the Benders were also evolving in ways that would ultimately work against them. Railroad development was making travel more predictable and traceable, meaning that missing persons could be tracked more effectively. Telegraph communications allowed families to maintain contact with traveling relatives, making unexplained disappearances more noticeable and concerning. Weather patterns during this period had also worked against the family's disposal methods. An unusually wet spring had caused flooding that exposed some of their burial sites, while drought conditions later in the year had lowered water levels in streams and ponds where they had dumped body parts. These environmental factors created new opportunities for discovery that the Benders had not anticipated when they established their killing ground. The family's overconfidence had led them to become careless about maintaining their cover stories. Contradictions in their accounts of guests' departures had begun to accumulate, creating a pattern of inconsistencies that observant neighbors were starting to notice. Their explanations for why certain travelers had left suddenly without their belongings, or why valuable items appeared in their possession, became increasingly implausible. As spring turned toward summer in 1873, All of these factors were converging toward an inevitable confrontation. The Benders had created a criminal enterprise that was too successful for its own good, drawing attention from multiple directions while simultaneously making them overconfident about their ability to continue operating with impunity. By the winter of 1873, the Bender family had perfected their deadly operation into something far more sophisticated and profitable than their early crude murders. What had begun as opportunistic killings of vulnerable travelers had evolved into a systematic enterprise that combined psychological manipulation, refined murder techniques, and careful disposal methods with an almost business-like efficiency that would have impressed legitimate entrepreneurs of the era. The family's confidence had grown exponentially with each successful kill. Kate Bender's spiritualist performances had become more elaborate and convincing, drawing larger crowds from neighboring towns who came seeking communication with deceased loved ones or healing for various ailments. Her reputation as Professor Miss Katie Bender had spread throughout southeastern Kansas, providing the perfect cover for identifying wealthy potential victims among her clientele. During these sessions, she would carefully probe attendees about their travel plans, financial circumstances, and family connections, all while maintaining the facade of spiritual guidance. The physical setup of their operation had also undergone significant improvements. The blood-soaked cellar had been expanded and better ventilated, with a more efficient drainage system that allowed them to process multiple victims without the overwhelming stench that had initially plagued their early murders. They had acquired additional hammers of varying weights, each suited for different types of victims, and Kate had become particularly skilled with her throat-cutting technique, able to silence a victim within seconds of the initial hammer blow. Their victim selection process had become remarkably sophisticated. Rather than simply targeting whoever happened to stop at their inn, the Benders now actively recruited specific types of travelers. They had developed a network of informants in nearby towns who would alert them to wealthy individuals passing through the area, particularly those traveling alone or with small children who would be easy to control. John Sr. had even begun making trips to towns along the Osage Trail, posing as a friendly local and engaging travelers in conversation to assess their suitability as victims. The psychological aspects of their operation had reached a disturbing level of refinement. The family had learned to work together like a well-rehearsed theater troupe, with each member playing their role to perfection. Ma Bender would greet travelers with maternal warmth, offering hot meals and comfortable lodging after long days on the trail. John Jr., despite his mental limitations, had proven surprisingly effective at putting guests at ease with his seemingly innocent demeanor and childlike enthusiasm. Meanwhile, John Sr. would regale visitors with tales of frontier life, keeping them distracted while Kate prepared for the evening's deadly entertainment. Kate's role had become central to their success. Her combination of beauty, charisma, and supposed spiritual powers made her irresistible to many male travelers who would linger at the inn far longer than they had originally planned. She had perfected the art of making each victim feel special and chosen, often claiming that the spirits had guided them to the Bender Inn for a specific purpose. This psychological manipulation made victims more compliant and less likely to resist when the fatal moment arrived. The family had also developed contingency plans for various scenarios. If a traveler seemed suspicious or difficult to control, they would simply provide normal hospitality and send them on their way, preferring to wait for easier targets rather than risk exposure. They had established signals and procedures for handling groups of travelers, including methods for separating individuals from their companions and dealing with witnesses who might escape. Their disposal methods had become increasingly efficient and thorough. Bodies were now systematically stripped of all valuable items before burial, with clothing and personal effects either burned or sold in distant towns where they wouldn't be recognized. The Benders had mapped out multiple burial sites across their property and neighboring areas, ensuring that no single location would contain enough remains to attract attention if accidentally discovered. The financial rewards of their murderous enterprise had transformed the family's circumstances dramatically. What had once been a modest frontier homestead now boasted improved furnishings, better livestock, and a substantial cache of gold and currency hidden throughout the property. They had opened accounts at banks in multiple towns under various names, carefully depositing their ill-gotten gains in amounts that wouldn't arouse suspicion. Perhaps most disturbing was how the Benders had begun to view their victims not as human beings, but as resources to be harvested. They kept detailed records of each murder, noting the victim's appearance, possessions, and the effectiveness of different killing methods. Kate had even begun conducting crude experiments on some victims before killing them, exploring how long someone could remain conscious after various types of injuries, all in the name of what she called expanding human understanding of the transition between life and death. The family's success had bred a dangerous overconfidence that would ultimately prove to be their downfall. They had begun taking greater risks, targeting more prominent individuals, and expanding their hunting grounds beyond the relative safety of their isolated inn. John Sr. had started boasting about their prosperity to neighbors, claiming that their business was thriving beyond all expectations. Kate's public spiritualist performances had grown more elaborate and attention-grabbing, drawing the kind of notice that a family of serial killers should have avoided at all costs. By early 1873, local law enforcement had begun receiving reports of unusual activity around the Bender property. Neighbors mentioned seeing wagons leaving the inn at odd hours, hearing strange sounds during the night, and noticing that many travelers who stopped at the Bender place were never seen continuing their journeys. The distinctive smell that occasionally drifted from the property during certain weather conditions had also begun attracting unwanted attention from passing travelers and nearby residents. The Benders had created a perfect storm of circumstances that would soon converge to expose their murderous enterprise. Their refined methods and increased confidence had made them more effective killers, but they had also made them more visible to the very authorities and community members who would eventually bring their reign of terror to an end. The systematic efficiency that had made their operation so profitable had also created patterns of behavior that astute observers would recognize as evidence of something far more sinister than simple frontier hospitality. As winter gave way to spring in 1873, the Bloody Benders stood at the pinnacle of their murderous career, having transformed from crude opportunistic killers into sophisticated predators who had perfected the art of luring, killing, and disposing of human beings with cold-blooded efficiency. The Bender family's reign of terror was about to enter its most calculated and deadly phase. By 1873, their roadside inn had become a perfectly calibrated killing machine, but their growing confidence would soon push them beyond the careful boundaries that had kept them hidden for so long. Kate Bender had evolved into the operation's most sophisticated component. Her spiritualist performances now drew visitors from towns as far as 50 miles away, creating a steady stream of potential victims who arrived already predisposed to trust her supernatural claims. She had refined her technique of reading people, identifying within minutes of meeting someone whether they were suitable targets or potential threats to avoid. During her seances, Kate would carefully probe attendees for information about their travel plans, family connections, and financial circumstances. Those who mentioned traveling alone, carrying significant money, or having no one expecting their immediate return became marked for elimination. She developed an almost supernatural ability to manipulate people's emotions, convincing them that the spirits demanded they stay overnight for additional spiritual cleansing, or that their departed loved ones had urgent messages requiring extended sessions. Ma Bender had become the operation's enforcer and disposal expert. Her violent temper, once a liability, was now channeled into the methodical brutality required for their murders. She had studied anatomy from medical texts, learning the most efficient ways to incapacitate victims quickly and quietly. Her knowledge of human physiology allowed the family to extract maximum suffering while ensuring victims couldn't cry out or escape. The matriarch also managed the complex logistics of body disposal. She had mapped every depression, ravine, and hidden spot within a 10-mile radius of their property. Different locations were used for different types of victims, with some bodies buried in their garden where the disturbed soil could be explained as agricultural work, while others were transported miles away to locations that would never be associated with the Bender property. John Sr. had transformed from a brutish immigrant into a calculating predator. His imposing physical presence and limited English had initially seemed like disadvantages, but he learned to use both as weapons. Victims often underestimated him, assuming his grunted responses and broken speech indicated stupidity rather than careful observation. He would study travelers for hours, noting their weapons, their physical condition, and their level of alertness before the family decided whether to act. The patriarch also developed the family's network of regional contacts. Through careful cultivation of relationships with other German immigrants, local merchants, and even some law enforcement officials, he created a web of information sources and potential alibis. Some of these contacts were willing accomplices who received payment for directing suitable victims to the Bender Inn, while others were unwitting participants who simply saw the family as fellow immigrants trying to make an honest living. John Jr. remained the operation's wild card, but his apparent mental deficiency had become another calculated tool. His childlike demeanor and sudden outbursts of laughter disarmed victims who might otherwise be suspicious of the family's intentions. Behind his vacant stare, however, lay a vicious killer who particularly enjoyed the family's most brutal murders. The younger John had developed his own specialty within their operation, becoming expert at tracking and stalking victims who managed to escape their initial attempts. His knowledge of the local terrain and ability to move silently through the prairie made him invaluable for hunting down witnesses or finishing off victims who survived their initial assault. Several travelers who thought they had escaped the Bender property were later found dead miles away, killed by John Jr. during his nighttime hunts. The family's methodology had evolved far beyond their crude early attempts. They now operated with the precision of a military unit, with each member playing specific roles during different phases of their killings. Kate would identify and isolate victims, using her spiritual consultations to determine the optimal time and method for each murder. Ma Bender would prepare the killing ground, ensuring all tools were sharpened and positioned, while also preparing the cellar for body storage and blood cleanup. John Sr. handled the actual killing in most cases, his massive hands capable of crushing skulls or snapping necks with minimal noise. He had learned to read the angles required to strike victims from behind the canvas curtain, calculating the exact force needed to incapacitate without causing immediately fatal wounds that would end the victim's suffering too quickly. John Jr. served as lookout and backup killer, positioned to prevent escapes and handle any complications that arose during their murders. His role also included the grisly task of mutilating bodies and preparing them for disposal, work that seemed to provide him with genuine pleasure. The family had also developed elaborate financial schemes to maximize profit from their crimes. Beyond simply robbing their victims, they had learned to forge documents, assume identities, and even collect on insurance policies in some cases. Kate's literacy and education made her valuable for these more sophisticated frauds, while her growing reputation as a spiritualist provided cover for unusual financial transactions. Their network of body sales to medical institutions had expanded significantly. Through Deacon Silas's old contacts and new relationships Kate cultivated, they now supplied specimens to schools in Missouri, Illinois, and even as far as Pennsylvania. The steady income from these sales, combined with their robbery proceeds, had made the Benders surprisingly wealthy for frontier settlers. But their success was also breeding the overconfidence that would ultimately destroy them. By early 1873, the family was killing with increasing frequency and taking greater risks. They had begun targeting victims who were more likely to be missed, including travelers with established routes and schedules. Their disposal methods, while sophisticated, couldn't keep pace with their accelerated killing schedule. Local rumors were becoming harder to dismiss. Too many travelers had disappeared along the same stretch of the Osage Trail. Too many people had reported strange sounds and lights coming from the Bender property at night. The family's explanations for their prosperity were wearing thin among neighbors who knew the limited income potential of a frontier inn. Most dangerously, they had begun to believe their own mythology. Kate's spiritual performances had evolved into genuine delusions of supernatural power. She increasingly saw their murders not as crimes, but as spiritual elevation, convinced that she was helping souls transition to higher planes of existence. This religious mania made her careless about covering their tracks and dismissive of potential threats. Ma Bender's violent nature was becoming harder to control, leading to unnecessarily brutal killings that left more evidence and created more disturbing crime scenes. Her temper had led to several confrontations with neighbors and local officials that drew unwanted attention to the family. John Sr.'s network of contacts was becoming a liability as much as an asset. Too many people knew too much about the family's activities, creating potential witnesses who could expose them if properly motivated by law enforcement. The family's downfall began with their most audacious target yet. Dr. William York represented everything they had previously avoided. A respected professional with family connections to military and law enforcement, traveling a known route with people expecting his arrival. But his obvious wealth and the valuable medical equipment he carried proved too tempting for the increasingly reckless Benders. When Dr. York arrived at their inn in March 1873, the family saw only opportunity. They failed to recognize that this victim would bring consequences unlike any they had faced before. His brother, Colonel York, possessed both the resources and determination to conduct the kind of thorough investigation that would finally expose their carefully constructed facade. The doctor's murder followed their established pattern, but for the first time, the Benders had killed someone whose disappearance would mobilize serious law enforcement attention. Within days of Colonel York's first visit to their property, the family realized they had made a fatal error. Their network of contacts brought word that a massive search was being organized, involving not just local authorities but federal investigators. For nearly 3 years, the Bloody Benders had operated with virtual impunity, transforming murder into a profitable enterprise while maintaining their cover as humble frontier settlers. They had refined their methods, expanded their network, and accumulated wealth beyond the dreams of most immigrants. But their success had bred the arrogance that would finally bring their reign of terror to an end. The family that had once been so careful about selecting victims and covering their tracks was about to discover that even the most sophisticated criminal operation could be undone by a single mistake. Dr. York's murder would set in motion the events that would expose the full horror of their crimes and launch one of the largest manhunts in American history. As they prepared to abandon the property that had served as both home and killing ground, the Benders left behind evidence of crimes that would shock the nation and create a legend that would endure for generations. The investigation that followed Dr. William York's disappearance in March 1873 would unravel one of the most methodical and horrifying crime sprees in American frontier history. When Colonel Alexander York and his search party arrived at the Bender homestead on April 3rd, they found themselves face to face with a family that had perfected the art of deception through 3 years of systematic murder. Ma Bender's immediate hostility toward the searchers was telling. Her aggressive denial of any knowledge about Dr. York's whereabouts, combined with accusations that the men were harassing her family without cause, revealed the defensive posture of someone with much to hide. But it was Kate's intervention that demonstrated the family's sophisticated approach to managing suspicion. Her admission that the doctor had indeed visited, coupled with her offer to use her supposed psychic abilities to locate him, showed how the Benders had learned to blend truth with misdirection. Kate's performance was masterful in its manipulation. By falling into a theatrical trance and claiming the spirits refused to speak with so many men present, she accomplished multiple objectives simultaneously. She appeared cooperative while buying time, created a reason to get the colonel alone where he could be more easily eliminated, and reinforced her spiritual persona that had served the family so well in identifying vulnerable targets. Her suggestion that Colonel York return alone the following day was nothing less than an invitation to become their next victim. The family's coordinated response revealed their experience in handling inquiries about missing travelers. John Jr.'s suggestion to search near Drum Creek, complete with his story about being shot at in the area, was a calculated misdirection designed to send the search party away from their property. The fact that the searchers found only a buried dead pig at the suggested location speaks to the Benders' preparation for such contingencies. They had likely planted evidence in various locations to create false leads and waste investigators' time. What the search party couldn't have known was that they were standing mere feet from Dr. York's body, buried in the family's garden alongside at least 8 other victims. The Benders' composure during this interrogation, knowing they were literally standing over their crimes, demonstrates the psychological coldness that had enabled their 3-year killing spree. They had grown so confident in their methods and their ability to deflect suspicion that they felt comfortable entertaining law enforcement officers on their own property. The family's decision to flee immediately after this encounter reveals that despite their outward calm, they recognized the increased danger. Dr. York was not some anonymous drifter whose disappearance would go unnoticed. He was a respected physician with family connections to military and political circles. His brother's persistence in searching for him, combined with the resources at the colonel's disposal, represented a level of scrutiny the Benders had never faced before. Their escape was as methodical as their crimes had been. The family gathered their most valuable possessions, hitched their team, and vanished into the Kansas prairie under cover of darkness. They left behind only what they couldn't easily transport, abandoning their homestead but taking with them the accumulated wealth from 3 years of robbery and murder. The timing of their departure, just hours after the search party's visit, indicates they had always maintained an escape plan for exactly this scenario. The discovery of their abandoned homestead a month later revealed the true scope of their operation. When neighbor Billy Toll and his companions forced their way into the cabin, they encountered a scene that spoke to hasty departure rather than gradual abandonment. Clothing and personal items strewn throughout the interior suggested the family had grabbed only essentials before fleeing. The dozen bullet holes puncturing the walls and ceiling hinted at violence that had occurred within the cabin's confines, possibly from victims who had fought back or warning shots fired to intimidate travelers. But it was the cellar that revealed the industrial scale of the Benders' butchery. What appeared at first glance to be slime coating the walls and floor was actually congealed blood from countless victims. The overwhelming stench of death that drove the initial investigators from the cabin spoke to the volume of killing that had taken place in this confined space. The cellar had served as both slaughterhouse and temporary morgue, where victims were taken to bleed out after being struck down in the cabin above. Colonel York's discovery of his brother's eyeglasses among the abandoned possessions confirmed his worst fears while providing the first concrete evidence linking the Benders to the disappearances. The glasses, which Dr. York would never have willingly parted with, proved he had been inside the cabin and suggested he had met with foul play. This physical evidence transformed the investigation from a missing person case into a murder inquiry. The systematic excavation of the Bender property that followed revealed the true horror of what had transpired there. The slight depression in the garden that caught Colonel York's attention was the first of many graves that would be uncovered. When his wagon rod struck something solid beneath the earth and came up with bits of human remains, it marked the beginning of one of the most grisly archaeological excavations in American criminal history. Dr. York's body, found naked save for an undershirt with his skull crushed and throat slashed, bore the signature injuries that would be found on every subsequent victim. The methodical nature of these wounds spoke to a practiced technique refined through repetition. The blow to the back of the head was designed to incapacitate quickly and quietly, while the throat cutting ensured death while allowing the body to drain in the cellar below. As more bodies were uncovered, the pattern became unmistakable. Henry Mackenzie, found buried beside Dr. York, showed identical injuries. The discovery of George Longcore alongside his 19-month-old daughter Mary revealed perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Benders' crimes. While Longcore bore the usual markings of hammer blow and slashed throat, little Mary showed no signs of physical violence. The dirt and clay still clutched in her tiny mittened hands told a more horrifying story. She had been buried alive, struggling desperately to dig her way out of her premature grave. This discovery transformed public perception of the case from mere murder to something approaching the demonic. The image of a toddler clawing at the earth above her head while slowly suffocating captured the public imagination in ways that adult murders, however brutal, could not. It demonstrated that the Benders' killing was not simply about robbery or even sadistic pleasure, but reflected a complete absence of human compassion that extended even to innocent children. The crowd of nearly 1,000 people that descended on the homestead as the excavation continued represented more than morbid curiosity. It was a community's attempt to comprehend evil that exceeded their understanding of human nature. These were frontier people familiar with violence and death. Yet what they witnessed at the Bender property challenged their fundamental assumptions about the limits of human depravity. The discovery of additional bodies in the orchard and abandoned well expanded the crime scene beyond the garden, suggesting the family had been forced to find new burial locations as their operation grew. The total of 9 confirmed victims represented only those bodies that could be recovered and identified. Given the Benders' 3-year operation and the numerous travelers who had disappeared along the Osage Trail during that period, the actual death toll was likely significantly higher. The physical evidence found within the cabin told the story of the family's methodology. The collection of hammers ranging from delicate shoemaker tools to heavy sledges indicated they had selected their weapons based on the size and apparent strength of their intended victims. The positioning of the dinner table relative to the canvas curtain revealed their tactical approach to murder, using hospitality as a weapon to position victims for attack. The few survivors who came forward after the discovery provided crucial testimony about the family's methods. Charles Howlett's account of hearing a noise and turning to find someone approaching from behind with a hammer confirmed investigators' theories about how the murders were committed. His quick draw of his revolver and the would-be attacker's stammered excuse about fixing a loose nail revealed how close he had come to joining the victims in the garden. The apocryphal story of gunfighter John Wesley Hardin's visit, while never confirmed, added another dimension to understanding the Benders' selection process. If true, Hardin's instinctive decision to move away from the curtain and his early departure the next morning suggested that experienced frontiersmen possessed an intuitive wariness that less seasoned travelers lacked. The fact that even a notorious killer like Hardin might have fallen victim to the family's methods only emphasized their effectiveness. The manhunt that followed the discovery represented one of the largest law enforcement efforts in Kansas history. The $2,000 combined reward offered by Colonel York and the Kansas governor was substantial enough to attract bounty hunters and amateur investigators from across the region. Yet despite this financial incentive and the extensive resources devoted to the search, the Benders seemed to have vanished as completely as their victims once had. The trail that led investigators to St. Louis before going cold suggested the family had maintained escape routes and possibly Confederates who assisted their flight. Their ability to disappear so completely despite the massive manhunt indicated a level of preparation that extended beyond their murder methods to include detailed contingency planning for exactly this scenario. The numerous reported sightings that followed, placing the Benders everywhere from Indian Territory to Europe, reflected both the public's fascination with their fate and the difficulty of tracking fugitives in an era before modern communication and identification systems. Each false lead only added to the legend while highlighting the limitations of 19th century law enforcement. The psychological impact of the Bender case extended far beyond the immediate investigation. For the first time, Americans were confronted with the reality that evil could hide behind the facade of ordinary family life, that hospitality could mask murderous intent, and that the frontier's promise of new beginnings could also provide cover for those fleeing their past crimes. The discovery of the Bender property sent shockwaves far beyond the small community of Labette County. Word of the gruesome findings spread like wildfire across the frontier, carried by telegraph lines and whispered conversations that grew more horrific with each retelling. What authorities had uncovered wasn't just a crime scene, but evidence of something that challenged the very notion of civilized society on the American frontier. As investigators continued their methodical excavation of the property, the true scope of the Bender operation became increasingly clear. The family hadn't simply been opportunistic killers preying on the occasional traveler. They had created a systematic enterprise designed to identify, lure, murder, and dispose of victims with chilling efficiency. Every aspect of their inn had been carefully designed to facilitate their deadly work. The positioning of the dining table was no accident. Visitors were always seated with their backs to the canvas curtain, creating a perfect blind spot where an attacker could approach undetected. The heavy hammers found throughout the cabin weren't tools for honest work, but instruments of murder, each one sized for different types of victims. Even the cellar's design served their purposes, with its stone walls and packed earth floor ideal for containing the blood and remains of their victims while they planned disposal. But perhaps most disturbing was the evidence of the family's psychological preparation for their crimes. Kate's spiritualism wasn't merely a cover story or a way to attract victims, though it served both purposes effectively. The seances and spiritual consultations she conducted allowed her to study potential targets, learning about their backgrounds, their destinations, and most importantly, who might come looking for them if they disappeared. The family had developed an almost scientific approach to victim selection. Wealthy travelers were preferred not just for their money, but because their possessions could be sold in distant markets without raising suspicion. Men traveling alone were ideal targets, as their disappearances were less likely to prompt immediate searches. Families with young children presented both opportunity and risk, but the Benders had proven willing to murder even infants when circumstances demanded it. Evidence suggested they had maintained detailed records of their activities, though most of these documents had been destroyed or removed before their flight. Fragments found in the cabin's fireplace included what appeared to be names, dates, and dollar amounts, suggesting they had tracked both their victims and their profits with business-like precision. This wasn't the work of deranged killers acting on impulse, but a calculated criminal enterprise that had operated for years. The physical evidence told its own horrific story. The blood-soaked cellar showed signs of repeated use, with layers of staining that suggested dozens of victims had been butchered there. Scratches on the stone walls indicated desperate attempts by dying victims to escape their fate. Most chilling were the small handprints found near the cellar entrance, evidence that children had been brought to this nightmare space and had tried to claw their way to safety. The hammer blows that killed most victims showed a pattern of escalating violence over time. Early victims appeared to have been killed with single, precise strikes to the back of the head. Later, victims showed evidence of multiple blows, suggesting either that the killers had become more savage with experience or that they had begun to take pleasure in their victims' suffering. The throat cutting that followed seemed designed not just to ensure death, but to facilitate blood drainage, another sign of their methodical approach. As news of the discoveries spread, other communities began re-examining their own unsolved disappearances. Reports flooded in from across Kansas, Missouri, and the Indian Territory of travelers who had vanished along various routes. Many of these cases shared disturbing similarities, suggesting the Benders might have been part of a larger network of frontier killers or had been active for far longer than initially believed. The timing of the Benders' flight proved they had been monitoring the search for Dr. York closely. Their ability to disappear so completely suggested careful preparation and possibly assistance from Confederates. The wagon tracks leading away from their property had been deliberately obscured, and their escape route appeared to have been planned well in advance. This level of preparation indicated they had always known their activities would eventually be discovered and had developed contingency plans accordingly. Local authorities found themselves overwhelmed by the scope of the investigation. The Kansas frontier had seen its share of violence, but nothing approaching the systematic nature of the Bender crimes. The discovery challenged fundamental assumptions about safety and civilization in the expanding American West. If a family could operate such an enterprise for years in a settled area with neighbors and regular travelers, what other horrors might be lurking in more remote regions? The psychological impact on the local community was profound. Neighbors who had interacted with the Benders now questioned their own judgment and safety. How had such obviously dangerous people managed to maintain their facade for so long? The realization that Kate Bender's spiritualist performances had been scouting missions for potential victims added another layer of violation, as community members realized they had been studied and evaluated as possible targets. The investigation revealed that the Benders had been incredibly selective about which travelers they targeted and which they allowed to pass through safely. This selectivity had been crucial to their long-term success, as it meant that many people had pleasant or unremarkable experiences at their inn, providing cover for their criminal activities. The family had understood that killing every visitor would quickly attract attention, so they had chosen their victims carefully based on factors that minimized risk of discovery. Evidence suggested the family had different roles in their murderous enterprise. John Sr. appeared to be the primary muscle, delivering the fatal hammer blows from behind the curtain. Ma Bender seemed to handle the practical aspects, managing the inn's operations and helping dispose of bodies. John Jr.'s role was less clear, but witnesses suggested he had served as a lookout and had helped with the physical work of burial. Kate's role was perhaps the most sophisticated, using her spiritualist persona to gather intelligence and identify suitable victims. The family's German immigrant status had initially provided them with a degree of protection from suspicion. In an era when many frontier communities were populated by immigrants from various countries, their accents and customs hadn't seemed particularly noteworthy. This cultural camouflage had allowed them to blend into the community while maintaining enough distance to avoid close scrutiny of their activities. As the full extent of the horror became clear, the Bender case began to take on mythic proportions in American folklore. The story embodied deep-seated fears about the frontier, about trusting strangers, and about the thin veneer of civilization that separated order from chaos. The fact that the killers had escaped justice only added to the story's dark power, leaving communities across the West wondering if the Benders might resurface in their own neighborhoods. The case would ultimately change how travelers approached frontier hospitality, making people more cautious about accepting lodging from strangers and more aware of the potential dangers lurking behind seemingly innocent facades. The search parties that combed the Kansas prairie in the spring of 1873 had expected to find answers. What they discovered instead was something that would haunt the American frontier for generations to come. As investigators continued their grim excavation of the Bender property, the true scope of the family's systematic brutality began to emerge from the blood-soaked earth. The bodies told their own horrific story. Each victim bore the same telltale marks of the Benders' methodical killing process. The back of the skull crushed by hammer blows, throats sliced from ear to ear with surgical precision. Most had been stripped naked save for undergarments, their belongings rifled through and stolen. But it was the condition of the remains that revealed just how calculated and efficient the Benders had become at their deadly trade. Dr. William York's body showed clear evidence of the family's evolving technique. The initial hammer blow had been delivered with such force that it had cracked his skull like an eggshell, but the angles suggested he had been seated when struck. His throat had been cut so deeply that it nearly severed his head entirely. The precision of the wound indicated someone with practice, someone who had done this many times before. As the crowd of nearly 1,000 onlookers watched in horrified fascination, investigators continued their methodical excavation. Each new grave revealed another chapter in the Benders' reign of terror. Henry Mackenzie, who had disappeared months earlier while traveling to visit family, was found buried alongside Dr. York. His skull bore the same crushing injuries, his throat the same precise cut. But it was the discovery of George Longcore and his 19-month-old daughter that truly shocked even the hardened frontier men conducting the search. Longcore, a recent widower traveling back to Iowa with his young child, showed the familiar signs of the Benders' violence. Little Mary, however, told a different and more disturbing story. Her tiny hands, still covered in mittens, were clenched tight with dirt and clay. The investigators realized with growing horror that the child had been buried alive, her small fingers clawing desperately at the earth as she slowly suffocated in her makeshift grave. The systematic nature of the killings became clearer as more bodies were unearthed. The Benders had developed their method over nearly 3 years of operation, refining their technique with each victim. The positioning of the bodies in the graves showed careful planning. The deeper burials were reserved for victims who might be searched for more thoroughly, while transients and drifters were buried in shallower graves, or sometimes simply dumped in the abandoned well on the property. Evidence scattered throughout the cabin revealed the family's modus operandi in chilling detail. Multiple hammers of varying sizes were found, from delicate shoemaker's tools to heavy sledgehammers, suggesting the Benders selected their weapon based on the size and build of their victim. The blood evidence in the cellar painted a picture of systematic butchery. Victims were likely dragged down into the cellar immediately after being struck, where they would bleed out onto the dirt floor before being stripped of their valuables and prepared for burial. The canvas curtain that divided the cabin served as more than just a room separator. It was the key element in the Benders' killing method. Travelers would be seated at the small table with their backs to the curtain, unaware that death waited just inches behind them. While Kate entertained guests with conversation about spiritualism or Ma Bender served food, either John Sr. or John Jr. would position themselves behind the canvas, hammer in hand. The strike would come without warning, delivered with enough force to ensure the victim could not cry out or resist. But the Benders were more than just opportunistic killers. Evidence suggested they actively lured victims to their remote inn. Kate's spiritualist lectures in nearby towns served as recruitment tools, drawing curious travelers who might then stop at the Bender Inn on their journey. Her advertisements as a healer and medium appeared in local newspapers, creating a steady stream of potential victims who came seeking supernatural guidance and found only death. The family's victim selection showed disturbing calculation. They targeted travelers who carried significant amounts of money, avoided victims who traveled in large groups, and preferred those whose disappearance might not be immediately noticed. Single men traveling for business, widowers relocating with their savings, and immigrants carrying their life's wealth were all prime targets for the Benders' deadly hospitality. Financial records found hidden in the cabin revealed the true scope of their criminal enterprise. Conservative estimates suggested the family had stolen over $10,000 from their victims, an enormous sum for the 1870s frontier. This money had been used to purchase additional land, livestock, and supplies, creating the appearance of a prosperous and successful homestead. The Benders had literally built their life on the blood money stolen from their victims. The investigation also uncovered evidence of the family's escape preparations. Hidden compartments contained emergency supplies, false identification papers, and detailed maps of routes leading out of Kansas. The Benders had clearly planned for the possibility of discovery, maintaining multiple escape plans and keeping their assets liquid for quick departure. Their flight after Colonel York's first visit had been swift and efficient, suggesting they had rehearsed their evacuation multiple times. As news of the discovery spread, more witnesses came forward with accounts of narrow escapes from the Bender Inn. Charles Howlett described hearing movement behind the curtain during his meal and turning to find someone approaching with a hammer. Only his quick draw of a revolver had saved his life. Another traveler reported feeling uneasy during his stay and choosing to sleep outside rather than in the cabin, a decision that likely saved his life. The legendary gunfighter John Wesley Hardin was later rumored to have stayed at the Bender Inn, though he never publicly confirmed the story. According to family accounts given years after his death, Hardin had grown suspicious during dinner and moved to sit facing the curtain rather than with his back to it. If true, his paranoid nature and quick reflexes had saved him from becoming another victim in the Benders' Garden of Death. Local residents began to piece together other disturbing memories as the investigation continued. Strange lights seen moving across the prairie at night. The sound of digging coming from the direction of the Bender property. Wagons leaving the homestead under cover of darkness. What had seemed like innocent frontier activity now took on sinister new meaning in light of the discoveries. The Benders' neighbors also recalled odd behavior that made more sense in hindsight. The family's reluctance to socialize beyond Kate's public appearances, their insistence on privacy around their property. Ma Bender's aggressive response to anyone who asked too many questions. John Sr.'s habit of speaking in grunts and gestures rather than clear words, possibly to disguise his accent or avoid revealing information. Even Kate's spiritualist activities took on new and disturbing dimensions. Her claims of communicating with the dead gained a horrific irony given the number of spirits that might have haunted the Bender property. Her lectures about the afterlife and transcendence became grotesque mockeries given her role in sending so many souls to whatever lay beyond. Her healing services were revealed as elaborate deceptions designed to identify wealthy marks for future robbery and murder. The investigation revealed that the Benders had been operating their deadly inn for nearly 3 years, from late 1870 until their flight in early 1873. During this period, they had systematically murdered at least 11 people, though many investigators believed the true number was significantly higher. Bodies found in neighboring counties showed similar injuries and were likely additional Bender victims who had been dumped away from the homestead to avoid detection. The family's escape had been masterfully executed. They had liquidated their assets, packed only essential belongings, and vanished into the vast American frontier with a significant head start over their pursuers. The abandoned wagon found near Thayer, Kansas, suggested they had switched to another form of transportation, possibly a train or riverboat that would allow them to travel quickly and anonymously to safety. As the manhunt intensified, rewards totaling over $2,000 were offered for information leading to the Benders' capture. This was life-changing money on the 1870s frontier, yet despite numerous reported sightings and investigations, no credible evidence of their whereabouts ever emerged. The family had vanished as completely as their victims had before the truth was discovered. The Bender case represented something new and terrifying in American criminal history. This was not random violence or crimes of passion, but systematic, premeditated murder carried out by an entire family working in coordination. They had turned hospitality into a weapon, using the frontier tradition of welcoming travelers to lure victims to their deaths. Their crimes revealed the dark underbelly of westward expansion, where isolation and lawlessness could provide perfect cover for unspeakable acts. The blood-soaked earth of the Bender homestead had finally given up its secrets, but the family responsible for the carnage had escaped into legend. Their victims, at least those whose bodies were recovered, could finally be laid to rest. The aftermath of the Bender murders would prove to be almost as mysterious and disturbing as the crimes themselves. What began as a manhunt for 4 killers would evolve into a decades-long puzzle that continues to baffle historians and amateur sleuths to this day. When news of the discovery at the Bender homestead spread across Kansas and beyond, it triggered one of the largest manhunts in American frontier history. The $2,000 reward offered by Colonel York and Kansas Governor Thomas Osborne represented a fortune in 1873 money, equivalent to roughly $50,000 today. Bounty hunters, law enforcement officers, and vigilante groups descended upon the region like locusts, all hoping to claim that prize. The initial trail seemed promising. Investigators tracked the Bender wagon to the town of Thayer, then followed it northeast toward Missouri. Witnesses reported seeing the distinctive family group at various stops along the way. A storekeeper in Oswego claimed they had purchased supplies from him just days after their departure. A ferryman near the Kansas-Missouri border remembered transporting them across a river. The trail led all the way to St. Louis, where several people reported spotting the family boarding a steamboat bound for New Orleans. But then, the trail went cold. Despite the massive reward and the intense public interest in the case, the Benders seemed to have vanished into thin air. This disappearance spawned countless theories, rumors, and alleged sightings that would persist for decades. One of the most persistent rumors involved vigilante justice. Multiple sources claimed that posses had caught up with the Benders somewhere in Indian Territory, now Oklahoma, and had executed them on the spot rather than bringing them back for trial. This theory gained credibility from several deathbed confessions made years later by men who claimed to have been part of such a vigilante group. The most detailed of these confessions came from a man named James Roach, who in 1908 told his family that he and 7 other men had tracked the Benders to a remote camp in what is now Oklahoma. According to Roach's account, they surrounded the family at dawn, confirmed their identities, and then hanged all 4 from a large oak tree before burning their bodies. Roach claimed they had sworn a blood oath never to reveal what they had done, but the secret had weighed on him for 35 years. Similar stories emerged from other sources. Laura Ingalls Wilder, who lived in the area as a child, later wrote that her father had always spoken of the Benders with a strange finality. saying they would never be found in a way that suggested he knew something others didn't. When pressed, he would only say that some forms of justice happened outside courtrooms. Yet for all these claims of vigilante justice, certain facts remain troubling. Why had no one ever claimed the substantial reward money? Why maintain such absolute secrecy about eliminating 4 of the most wanted criminals in America? The Kansas frontier was not exactly known for its restraint when dealing with murderers. Vigilante justice was often celebrated rather than hidden. The secrecy surrounding the alleged fate of the Benders suggested either that the stories were fabricated or that something even darker had occurred. Other theories placed the Benders in locations ranging from Mexico to Canada to Europe. A particularly colorful account claimed they had escaped in a hot air balloon, only to crash into the Gulf of Mexico during a storm. While obviously fantastical, this story appeared in several newspapers and demonstrated the public's fascination with the case. More credible sightings placed various members of the family in different locations over the years. A woman matching Kate's description was reportedly seen in Denver in 1874, working as a spiritualist under a different name. A man resembling John Bender Sr. was allegedly spotted in New Orleans in 1875, working on the docks. These sightings were investigated but never confirmed. The most significant development in the case came through the painstaking research of modern historians, particularly author Lee Ralph. Through extensive examination of census records, immigration documents, and newspaper archives, Ralph was able to trace the Benders' movements before they arrived in Kansas. His research suggested that the family had lived in Syracuse, New York, and later in Decatur, Illinois, before settling in Kansas. Most remarkably, Ralph's investigation revealed that the family may have originated not from Germany as commonly believed, but from the Alsace-Lorraine region of France. This discovery aligned with neighbors' recollections that Kate had occasionally spoken French and claimed knowledge of Napoleon Bonaparte, despite being born decades after his death. Census records from 1865 showed a family matching the Benders' description living in Syracuse. The head of household was listed as John Bender, a 42-year-old laborer born in Germany. His wife was recorded as Anna Maria Bender, maiden name Laudermilch, also born in Germany. The children were listed as John Jr. and Catherine, with Catherine notably listed as having been born in France rather than Germany. Ralph's research traced the family's immigration to America in 1863, arriving from the Alsace-Lorraine region during a period of political upheaval in that territory. This detail proved significant because it explained Kate's French language skills and her claims about her birthplace. Even more intriguing was Ralph's discovery of a death notice in a German-language Swiss newspaper from 1895. The notice sought information about the heirs of Anna Maria Bender, maiden name Laudermilch, who had recently died in Kirchhardt, Germany. The notice requested that her husband and children come forward to claim her belongings. If this notice referred to the murderous Ma Bender, it suggested that she had survived the manhunt and lived for more than 20 years after the murders, eventually dying alone in Germany. The fact that the notice sought her family members implied that they had either died before her or had maintained such complete separation that their whereabouts were unknown even to German authorities. This discovery raised new questions about the family's fate. Had they successfully escaped to Europe? Had they separated upon reaching safety, each member disappearing into a different life? Or had some died while others survived? The European connection gained additional credibility from a telegram received by the New York City police chief in May 1873, just weeks after the Benders' disappearance. The message, sent from Topeka, Kansas, claimed that the Bender family was planning to board a steamship in New York Harbor on May 23rd, bound for Le Havre, France. While this tip was investigated, no arrests were made, and it remains unclear whether the family actually made this journey. A Kansas judge later claimed to have received a letter postmarked from Germany, allegedly written by Kate Bender. The letter, if genuine, would have provided additional evidence that at least some family members had successfully reached Europe. However, the judge never produced the letter for examination, and its authenticity remains questionable. The possibility that the Benders escaped to Europe and lived out their lives in anonymity is both frustrating and somehow fitting. After committing what may have been America's first documented case of serial killing by an organized family unit, they simply vanished into the vast anonymity of 19th century immigration records and transatlantic travel. Yet, even if the European escape theory is correct, it leaves many questions unanswered. Did all 4 family members make the journey together? Did they remain together once they reached safety, or did they separate to reduce the risk of discovery? Most troubling of all, did they continue their murderous activities in their new home? The Bender case established patterns that would appear in serial killer investigations for decades to come. The systematic nature of their crimes, the use of their business as a hunting ground, and their ability to maintain a facade of respectability while committing horrific acts would be echoed by countless other killers throughout American history. Their methods also demonstrated a chilling level of premeditation and organization. The positioning of their victims' chairs with backs to the canvas curtain was not accidental. The collection of hammers of various sizes suggested they had experimented to find the most effective weapons. The blood-soaked cellar indicated they had developed an efficient system for disposing of bodies. These were not crimes of passion or opportunity, but calculated acts of predatory murder. The psychological dynamics within the Bender family remain equally disturbing. The apparent ease with which all 4 members participated in or facilitated the murders suggests either shared psychopathy or a level of coercion and control that bound the family together in their crimes. Kate's role as the public face of the operation, using her sexuality and spiritualist claims to lure victims, demonstrated a particularly calculating form of manipulation. Modern criminal psychologists studying the case have noted the Benders' use of what would now be called a comfort zone strategy. By operating from their own property and using their legitimate business as cover, they created an environment where they held complete control while their victims were isolated and vulnerable. This approach would be replicated by numerous serial killers in later decades. The case also highlighted the vulnerabilities of frontier travel and communication. The Osage Trail was a vital transportation route, but it passed through sparsely populated areas where travelers could disappear without immediate notice. The lack of rapid communication meant that patterns of disappearance took months or years to become apparent. By the time authorities recognized the scope of the problem, the perpetrators had already fled. The Bender murders occurred during a period when American society was grappling with massive social and economic changes. The westward expansion that brought opportunity also brought danger. The breakdown of traditional community structures meant that people often traveled alone and were unknown to those they encountered. The Benders exploited these vulnerabilities with deadly efficiency. Their crimes also reflected the darker aspects of 19th century spiritualism and alternative religious movements. Kate's claims of psychic abilities and her unconventional beliefs about morality provided a framework that may have helped justify the family's actions to themselves. The mixing of religious rhetoric with criminal behavior would become a recurring theme in American crime. The public fascination with the Bender case established many of the tropes that would define true crime storytelling for generations. The mysterious disappearance of the perpetrators, the gruesome discovery of multiple victims, and the tantalizing possibility that the killers might still be at large captured public imagination in ways that previous criminal cases had not. Newspaper coverage of the case was extensive and often sensationalized, with reporters competing to provide the most shocking details. This coverage helped spread awareness of the crimes, but also contributed to the proliferation of rumors and false information that continues to complicate understanding of the case today. The Bender homestead itself became a macabre tourist attraction almost immediately after the discovery of the bodies. Thousands of curiosity seekers visited the site, many taking souvenirs from the cabin and surrounding area. This early example of dark tourism demonstrated the public's appetite for contact with notorious crime scenes. The property changed hands multiple times over the decades, with several owners reporting strange occurrences they attributed to the site's violent history. While such claims should be viewed with skepticism, they reflect the lasting psychological impact of the Benders' crimes on the local community. In recent years, renewed archaeological interest in the site has raised hopes that additional evidence might be discovered. Ground-penetrating radar and other modern techniques have the potential to reveal previously unknown burial sites or other physical evidence that could provide new insights into the case. The current property owner has welcomed researchers and expressed hope that modern science might finally answer some of the lingering questions about the Benders' activities. However, nearly 150 years of farming, construction, and natural processes have likely destroyed or obscured much of the remaining evidence. The Bender case stands as more than just a historical curiosity. It represents a watershed moment in American criminal history, marking the emergence of organized serial killing as a recognized phenomenon. Their methods, motivations, and ultimate disappearance established patterns that would be studied by law enforcement and criminal psychologists for generations. Perhaps most significantly, the Benders demonstrated how ordinary-seeming people could harbor extraordinary capacity for evil. Their ability to maintain a facade of respectability while systematically murdering travelers revealed the potential for darkness that could lurk behind the most mundane exteriors. The question of their ultimate fate remains one of America's most enduring criminal mysteries. Whether they died at the hands of vigilantes, lived out their days in European anonymity, or met some other end, their story serves as a reminder of how easily people can vanish when they choose to disappear. In our modern age of constant surveillance and digital tracking, it seems almost impossible that 4 people could simply vanish without a trace. Yet the Benders managed exactly that, leaving behind only questions, theories, and the horrifying evidence of their crimes. Their legacy lives on not just in the true crime accounts and historical studies dedicated to their case, but in the fundamental questions they raise about human nature, justice, and the price of civilization. The Bloody Benders remind us that evil can take many forms, and that sometimes the most dangerous predators are those who appear most harmless. The empty grave of their story continues to haunt the American imagination, a reminder that some mysteries may never be solved and some criminals may never face earthly justice. In the end, perhaps that uncertainty is the most disturbing aspect of their legacy. The knowledge that somewhere in the vast expanse of history, 4 killers simply walked away from their crimes and disappeared into the darkness they had created.